As you probably know, I'm Freeman Allen, and it's my pleasure this evening to have Stuart Wood speaking to us. It's amazing what he's accomplished. It's his PhD thesis was on something related to climate change, but he tells me the talk this evening is based more on other things he's done outside of his thesis work. And in addition to that, he's taught at Laverne College for 5 years after he got his doctorate at the graduate school here in Claremont. And I just learned that he also taught at Pepperdine and San Bernardino, and most recently he's been working with Shoes That Fit writing materials. And when he joined Claremont, this is what really amazes me. He got engaged with Claremont just before the Earth Day event was coming up, so he had to immediately start running and did an amazing job ensuring that the Earth Day went well. And I think we're really lucky to have him as executive director. I'm not sure. Maybe we ought to just go ahead and get started, Stuart. Stuart's title this evening, which I always have to check on to be sure I get it quite right. Well, Stuart, why don't you tell them what the title is?
Yeah, so
and
let's
I'll just
talk
turn
climate.
it over to
It's nice and
yeah,
straightforward.
there it is. Let's talk about climate. Yeah. Okay. And I've been reading Bill McKibben's latest book, Falter, and he tells a story that's really harrowing. There are so many more aspects to what's going on than just climate change and its influence on the world. This talk seems particularly relevant, getting individuals engaged in doing something about climate change. So I'll turn it over to Stuart.
All right, thank you, Freeman. You know, I didn't think to ask if there's a...
By the way, Stuart, would you like these lights here off?
On's okay. Yeah, if you guys can all see that, that's just fine. Okay, so thank you, Freeman, for you always give me like the nicest introductions.
One other thing I didn't mention, the Claremont Courier produced a very nice article on Stuart on April 2nd. I have 3 copies of that up there if you'd like to look at it. What I've told you just skims the surface.
Yes,
so thank you.
Thank you, yes. Okay, so thank you guys for coming tonight. It's like a Monday night, and there aren't many people who would come to listen to like a lecture about how to talk about climate change. So I'm touched that you guys came, and I really do appreciate it. As Freeman mentioned earlier, I did do my dissertation on climate misinformation and disinformation and sort of how that works its way through the media and kind of infects the public mind and policy and politics and all that. And I think it's really interesting, but I think I've put a lot of people to sleep talking about it. And it's not really actionable. I think we all know what the politics of climate are, and we all know that there's disinformation out there. And so I didn't want to focus on that. I wanted to focus tonight on how we could talk about climate so that people act on climate no matter what they think. So despite their politics, despite their policy preferences, despite their religion, whatever. So take all those factors out of it. Just how do we get people to do things that we want them to do related to climate breakdown? So this is kind of our agenda for tonight. We'll kind of start off, brief introduction to myself, like I said before. We'll shift gears to looking at where Americans are on climate, what they think about climate, what kind of policies they want, where they want things to go, why communications matter, sort of a brief 3-slide history of climate communications, and then my breakdown of how to talk about climate. So there's like a lot of research out there on the most effective ways things you should focus on. Some of the best stuff, I think, are these like long 15-point studies on how to talk about climate, but like who can remember 15 points when they're having a conversation? So I try to really break it down and distill it into things that you should just keep top of mind when you're thinking about climate. And I'll do a running example of this, give you some resources at the end, and then we'll try to wrap things up. I'm told I have like 3 or 4 hours tonight. Is it? Okay. So American climate perspective. So where are Americans at? And what is it that they think needs to change? So next couple slides, all I really want us to take away from these are sort of the top lines. So when it comes to awareness that the climate is changing. So Americans are noticing impacts of climate change, okay? And at steadily increasing rates over the past few years. So you could look at 2015, 16, 17, 18, and the most recent later in 2018. You can see that for all of the correlated or caused events of climate change, Americans are noticing that it's getting hotter, that there's been more flooding, that there are increased drought conditions, more severe storms. So this is a trend that's going up. This is for all Americans. This isn't parsed out by party. Concern. People are concerned, and they're getting more concerned. So you can see the different surveys on the right, with all except for Gallup, just the one exception here. A majority of Americans are concerned, and that concern is kind of increasing depending on how you slice it, but there's a majority of Americans who are concerned about this. Urgency. People want action. They feel personal and collective urgency about their ability to reduce pollution and fossil fuel emissions that are causing climate change. So the way that this is kind of set up is kind of funky, but you can see the different questions on the bottom. And all of them are really getting at that sense of urgency, the sense of personal responsibility to do something. I know I'm going through these kind of quickly, but I just want you to take away that top line finding. Okay. And here, the last of the surveys we'll look at, solutions. Americans favor clean energy over other sources. So on the left, you start with clean energy, and then it kind of, towards the right, more traditional fuel sources. Wind and solar, natural gas kind of decreasing there, and then your traditional fossil fuels and nuclear seeing less support for expansion. Okay, so what does this mean? So that's kind of just setting the context for where we're at on kind of big picture ideas by the American public. And so we're focusing here on communication. So why this focus on communication? First, if you've ever had to tried to have this climate conversation before, it can be a difficult thing to talk about. You would know if you try to have this conversation at the dinner table or with friends or colleagues, or maybe you just don't even have that conversation because you know that you're going to be treading in some difficult water to do that. So it's a difficult problem, and for just the public, it's difficult to process the clear and present danger that is climate breakdown. Things are changing, but when the public's told that things are changing, it can be hard to make that click sort of mentally. So it can be confusing. It's difficult to follow. It hasn't been well presented. The impacts of climate breakdown often seem distant. We hear these projections of 50 years down the road, 100 years down the road. A lot of what's being projected isn't obvious, right? So we might see reports of, in the future, there's going to be more intense blizzards in a warming world. It doesn't seem to make intuitive sense, right? Or that there are going to be more intense rainstorms, because of higher temperatures. And so that's why you see those, like every winter, there's your sort of annual picture of like winter in Minnesota, and it's like snowing, and somebody's saying they could use a little more global warming. That's like a capture sort of this poorly presented information. A couple more things that complicate the matter. So it's partisan, right? So we know that this is an entrenched partisan issue. As soon as we start talking about climate change, it gets really tangled up with other issues, like the Green New Deal, right? Coal miners, right? All these sort of evoke partisan politics. Traditionally had more than one poor messengers. There's recently, just like 2 or 3 days ago, or maybe longer than that now, a week or two ago, Bill Nye was on John Oliver. And it was like funny and like it's good to see, and maybe he's saying what we're all thinking, but it doesn't do much to like change the debate, right? Who is that speaking to? Like what difference is sort of inflammatory rhetoric? Where is it getting us? And so he's a great person, maybe poor messenger in that instance. Okay, and there's just lots of complicating factors. So it's a complicated topic. It's hard to talk about. There are all these reasons why we just might not want to have that conversation in the first place. My sort of mission here, or in my previous work when I wrote on climate for several years, or when I taught courses, or now in my position here at Sustainable Claremont, is to get people to act and do something despite their belief in science, despite their political preferences. I don't care how much you care about the environment, right? It'd be great if you agreed with me on all these things, but I want you to do something, to act regardless, okay? And that's what, hopefully, good communications can do. And one of the other challenges here is to get people who do believe in science, or do care about the environment, or do have, share my politics, to get them to actually act. So it's nice if you sort of agree with me on everything, but I want you to do something about it, right? We all might have like plenty of friends who are sort of in our lane on all of these things, but they don't back it up with action, right? So we want all those things to sort of line up. Okay, and so what I'm going to be talking about today in this upcoming section, a minute or two, is a strategy for, it's kind of like a science communication strategy. So it's not just for climate change, and it's not just for academics or the public or congregations. It's for everybody. So it's for your community, for your family and friends. It's for your students if you're teaching, your congregations or faith communities, clients, customers, whatever, anybody. Okay, but how you talk about it's going to change depending on who your audience is. So you have to be mindful of your audience, of course. And it's also not just a strategy for climate change. It's a strategy for sort of any action that we're looking at surrounding the climate conversation, right? If it's one of our tree plantings, or community composting, or school gardens, green spaces, Green New Deal, right? Any of these things could sort of be shoved in this strategy, hopefully, and still be effective. I was going to take on the Green New Deal for tonight, but I thought that's probably a little too risky for tonight. And next dialogue. Okay, so this is going to be like a super quick outline of the past 40 years of the climate conversation. So just kind of stick with me. It just kind of shows us, hopefully, some of the different variants of how people have in the past or still are talking about climate, and why I want us to get away from that way of talking. So maybe in the 90s, early 2000s, a lot of the conversation around climate change was kind of doom and gloom. It was, polar bears are dying. There was a great commercial with these polar bears falling out of the sky onto cars in New York and Manhattan. And it was really powerful. Or Miami's sinking, the world is ending, doom and gloom. And it was really great for turning out the activist base, people who were really committed to environmentalism. It really sort of was fine-tuned to that. But for people who weren't, maybe they were sort of agnostic on environmental issues, or just didn't know much, or for other political reasons, it sort of turned them off. And so it brought in an important group into the debate, but it left out too many others. And we saw a shift maybe late 2007, 2010, maybe after Al Gore's movie in 2007, where we saw a lot more of the conversation around green jobs, green collar jobs, green infrastructure, how we can invest in infrastructure, create jobs, and have a greener economy. There's a lot of like articles written on taking coal miners and turning them into coders. It's been kind of like a colloquialism now. And today, the sort of third shift, and all these ways of talking are still there, obviously, but the most prominent, and I think the most successful form today of talking, is really tying it to personal relevance. So how is climate breakdown affecting your community? People in Claremont, and your family, and your kids, or your nieces and nephews, or your health, or their health, okay? And tapping into local community choice and local community values. So again, like I love polar bears. It's not effective for climate communication for a broader audience. In my next slides, I'll kind of dig deeper into like the strategy. We don't have any strategy yet. But there's sort of a growing debate in like the climate communication world, if that's like a thing. It is a thing. About the tone of climate communication. So I said in the previous couple slides, there's like the Green New Deal people and like jobs people, and there's the doom and gloom people. It's not clear to me like what's the correct way to do this. How hopeful we should be versus how honest we should be about the reality of the climate emergency that we're facing. So I think we'll come back to this, but I think sort of the tone is really like a personal decision. And so long as you're honest about what your feelings are on the seriousness of the climate emergency, I think it's okay to be really kind of get into that sort of darker, more realistic side of things. Or if you're not, if you just want to focus on the benefits, then you can keep a more hopeful tone. But the tone is sort of the one variable in this strategic guideline that really is up to the individual. And I think that the literature's unclear, unsettled on what tone is sort of the most productive. So this transition between these different ways of talking about climate, there's been a lot of social science research on the effectiveness of new communication tools. So this is basically the science communication literature. And there's been a lot done in this literature in the past decade or so. And so what I'm going to lay out in the next few slides for the strategy for moving forward, it's tied to the research. So it's not me speculating as to what I think is the most productive. It's what research says. It's what academics say. So take that for what it's worth. It's not just like a hunch. Okay, so let's kind of dig into this. Okay, so before we get to my 3-step guide, I wanted to take a step back when I was making this PowerPoint and think of when we're trying to communicate about climate change, what are we even trying to do? On the most basic level. And the first, I think, is that we want to emphasize that there's a problem. This is all very basic, of course, but there's a problem, right? Greenhouse gases are 415 parts per million. They've got to be down to 350 parts per million. The temperatures are rising at an ever-increasing rate, and we don't know how well we can mitigate that or adapt against that. So we have this really serious problem, right? So we want to get that problem across. And it affects us, all of us, you and me and our families and our kids and our friends. And it's not a problem for them or people down the road. It's a problem now. And that's what we saw in that survey research in the second slide. people are seeing it now. So we need to like reiterate that it's happening now. And so that needs to be that needs to sort of be in our head when we're talking about climate. But sort of most importantly, I think of the last 2 points, there is something we can do, and this is what it is, and this is how you do it. So this is the sort of call to action, the inspiring people to actually do something and telling them what they need to do and how they need to do it. So again, if we sort of think back to the Bill Nye, not that Bill Nye can not take a hit from me, but he sort of leaves us hanging with like, of course there's this huge problem and people need to grow up and really think about this problem and do something. But then like I watch that and I'm like, okay, what? Like, tell me what to do. Like, people want to do something. They have to be asked to do something, and they have to be given an avenue to act. So we need to tell people what they can do, not just scare them, right? But show them a path forward, right? Lead them. Okay, so this is it's either like 50 steps or 3 steps, and none of those like lists is quite adequate. So this is my 3-step guide to effective climate communication, or 4 or 5 steps, however you want to count it. Okay, so let me just jump into it. So the first is build rapport. So you want to have like some mutual understanding between the people that you're talking to. We'll get into each of these two in just a second here. The second, third, fourth, is inspire them, empower them, and get them to act. And last, I'll give you some sort of, hopefully, tips, guides, I don't know, whatever, to sort of strengthen the message, the overall message. So things that the social science research says is a better way of going about talking about climate, overall big picture. Okay, so let's just kind of jump into this, and then we'll kind of slowly work our way through each one. Okay, so build rapport. Okay, so the next couple slides, you'll have to forgive me, are going to be kind of texty, and we're going to kind of just slowly work our way through them. First, and maybe the most important, is, this sounds so basic, but start with people. So we want to start our conversation with the audience that we're talking to. So here it's people in Claremont, right? People at the Claremont colleges. However, like close you want to have this conversation. Maybe it's with your congregation. Maybe it's with your kids' class at school. But keep it local, right? We don't want to talk about humanity. It's too big, right? So start with people, with Claremonters, and move from people to climate, not the other way around. So you start with people, and then you move to effects of a changing climate. And you keep coming back to how those changes in the climate affect people. So really, this is all tying into neighborhoods, small communities, right? Relationships. Use tangible human concerns, so real issues that affect real families. So like, again, like I have nothing against polar bears, but I'll probably never see one in the wild, and probably none of you guys will either. And so like it's a great thing to evoke like in a Coca-Cola commercial, but it's not going to get somebody to stop driving a truck or to start planting trees. And so we want to keep the conversation about things that matter to people and that are close to people, not these sort of global concerns about climate. Again, like we're hoping that the changes that they make in their actions affect the global climate. But when we talk to them, we don't want to talk to them about too global of issues. And finally, down here, connect on common values. So again, I'm kind of like repeating myself on purpose here, maybe. But we really want to keep it as local as possible. Those closest to us, so children, family, communities, the future of Claremont, right? However it works best for your conversation. So I'm going to give a little example for each of these points here. So Here we're starting with people and we're connecting to common values. Now I'm going to give you an example of if I were writing a speech for some Claremont official. This is how I would start it. Okay. So Claremonters are noticing something different. Summers are hotter, droughts feel longer, fire season's more intense, damaging, winter storms are colder, rain is more intense, flooding like we've never seen, right? Connect it to Claremont. Okay. For each of the points I give in the next slides, I'll give another example. We're going to kind of build this message together. There was a debate at my house whether or not this was an effective strategy. So you'll have to let me know at the end of this. It's my anniversary today. And so I'm here with my first true love, climate communications. But my wife was, anyway. Okay. Make it real. So we're still on build rapport here. But when we're talking to our community, we want to make it real with impacts that are local and that we're seeing and that we're living. So things that are happening in Claremont, trees that are dying in our front yards, right? Grass that is dying in our parks, electricity bills that are going up in our homes, classrooms that are too hot during summer school for our kids, right? Whatever, pick your example. But it's things that we're all feeling together. And again, making them present, making them things that we already feel that are already happening, and reiterating that these are things that we naturally face. We know that there are droughts. We know that there are going to be days that are hotter than others. But that climate breakdown, right, this climate emergency that we're in, it takes these naturally occurring events and it makes them worse. Right? That's the message here. That's why we need to do something. So again, we'll kind of build on our thing here. So again, maybe this is effective, maybe it's not. This is our old part of our speech here, and we have our new. So these changes have real consequences. During the summer, our air conditioner bills are higher than ever. There are days in the summer where our children can hardly play outside because of the air pollution and the intense temperatures. Trees are dying because of drought. Increased pests and diseases, all threats made worse by a hotter climate, right? They're made worse by this climate emergency. They were there before, right? But they're made worse by these changes that we're seeing, that we're all seeing and we're all feeling. Okay, this is really the sort of most important part here, the Inspire, Empower, Act. One of the ongoing discussions in the climate communication world is how much you want to spend on the sort of not so nice tidbits and how quickly you want to shift to the action, actually we can do things. And so that's really where most of the controversy comes in. We could spend like 90% on how bad things are and how bad they're going to get, and 10% on what to do, or vice versa. So again, that's a tonal thing. That's something that you're going to have to decide what sort of works best for you or what you think fits your perspective on things most accurately. Okay, so Inspire, Empower, Act. So we want to empower our audience when we're talking, empower them to do something with actionable solutions. So I don't want to spend like 2 hours tonight or hour and a half tonight telling you how bad things are, and then you leaving and going home and not sleeping, right, and thinking about how the world's going to end. I want you to leave tonight thinking that there's a problem and we could do something. Okay, so we want to pair our climate message with solutions that are real solutions that aren't just, we want real solutions here. Ones that solve a problem, ones that people feel, ones that have personal benefits and local benefits, whether it's the economy, whether it's the health of the community or health of individuals or security, whatever. So pick sort of what works best for you and go with it. Again, you want to be authentic in your presenting of this material. If sort of public health is your domain and that's something you want to focus on, then focus on that. Like don't focus on planting trees if it's not something that you're passionate about. Like, that comes out in the message. So people know when you're being authentic versus when you have like a, kind of a written, canned response to these. Okay, so again, we're building our message. So Claremonters are working to address this problem. Already, the city and Sustainable Claremont have joined forces to plant new trees in our parks, parkways, and at our schools. Last year, we added more than 800 new trees throughout the city, ones that will increase canopy coverage, beautify our streets and neighborhoods, decrease air pollution, lower AC bills, cool homes, sequester CO2, and be enjoyed for generations to come, right? These are real things that are happening because we're planting so many trees, right? This is like a real solution to a real problem. And it's one I really care about and like. Urban forestry, I think, is like really cool. And so this is one that I would focus on, right? And so maybe if public health is your thing, you would want to, insert public health benefits of this. Children can play more at recess when there's shade on their school grounds, right? Or whatever the case may be. Okay. Empower, or inspire and empower. Okay. And having an ask. This is like one of the most important parts here. So we want the message to be that you can help. You in the audience can help. There's something that you can do tonight or tomorrow or next week or soon. There's something that you can really do that will really make a difference. And if you want to, if you choose to, you can make that difference. So now it's in your court. So I throw it to you, and I tell you how you can make that change. And I provide an ask. I'm going to ask you to do something. Okay. And I'm going to tell you how to do it. So again, we're creating like a pathway of like least resistance, right? We have this major problem. We know how serious it is. We've already talked about that. So this is what you can do now that we all agree it's a problem. This is what you can do now to make a difference. Okay. To make a real difference in Claremont, we are asking residents to get involved. Come to a tree planting. I have to plug Sustainable Claremont, right? Be like malpractice not to. Speak with your mayor or your city council members, your colleagues, family and friends about climate breakdown, and support local sustainability organizations. But these are things you can really do. And this isn't like obviously, like, we want your support. And you're here, so you probably support us already. But like a tree planting. If urban forestry is my thing and what I think is really cool, then I want to get you to come plant trees with us. And it's something that's real. It's like, you could drive down Baseline now and see like 102 trees that we planted like 2 months ago. Like, that's going to transform Baseline for like generations. And it's only because like, I don't know, a handful of people organized to get 100 plus residents out there and plant the trees. Right? And so this is something that like we could do. Like, we could solve these little problems, and you solve lots of little problems and you start making a dent in things. Okay, so we worked our way through Inspire, Empower, Act, and we're going to come back to this too. The third of this list of things in my guidebook is strengthen. So these are just it's kind of like all the extra stuff that I didn't really want to put in the first two, but are still important to crafting a strong, effective climate message. Okay, the first of these is to keep it simple and describe without jargon. So we have like a lot of academics in here probably, and it's really easy to cling to the jargon and to, like, in this group of people in this room, we probably know more about climate change than most people, because we're here tonight and we care and it's something that we invest a lot of time in. But most people don't, and so we need to sort of meet people where they are if we want them to act. So keep it simple. And the easiest way to do this is not to like memorize, like, flipping a key, like what we need to substitute for something else, but just describe things in their most basic essence. So climate change, yeah, like climate change is a thing that we all say, and I have to like try to actually literally make myself not say that. But like it doesn't do well to describe the situation we're in, right? And then you sort of always get this, oh, climate's always changed, right? And so, but when we say like climate emergency, that evokes like something. That's telling me something. It's not just a change. We're in like a real emergency here. Or breakdown, or crisis, or choose your phrase that works best for you. But again, it's just really describing the situation instead of using jargon. Global warming, like I could use a little more global warming when it's cold outside, right? But that's not what, so trying to think of something else that really gets to it. Climate skeptics saying climate science denier, biodiversity loss. People don't know what biodiversity is. Loss of wildlife, right? That kind of is a more powerful phrase. And these, I sort of picked these four because The Guardian, the London newspaper, is this the London newspaper, the UK newspaper? The editorial team just changed their editorial guidelines this week to make these switches. So they're no longer in their coverage of climate change going to use the term climate change. And so it's something that like industry is sort of savvy to, and there's sort of a growing awareness that the way we talk about these things matters. And so it matters for journalists, it matters for us climate communicators. This is kind of working off the last slide. Just describe things, don't label them. So I like our trees are dying. I don't like our trees are dying, but I like the phrase our trees are dying more than we face urban canopy decay. Right? So it's just like another jargony thing, and like it's something that if I were writing like a paper on it, what I would say we face urban canopy decay, but it's just not a helpful way to talk about it, right? We just want to be like very clear. What do we mean, and what do we want our audience to hear? Right? Which one is more powerful? When we're talking about climate, it's a good idea to have some piece of information in our back pocket from a trusted source, and we'll sort of let you decide what a trusted source is. If we're talking about recycling or trees or waste, maybe it's the Community Services Department at the city. Or if we're talking about sort of a bigger climate issue, maybe it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Or if it's something local, maybe Sustainable Claremont, right? And so having sort of information or one or two facts or a blurb from a trusted source is a good way to sort of show that you have some sort of authority or knowledge on a subject without getting into the weeds. You don't want to argue the science with people, but it's good to have sort of show that you're grounded in the research when you're talking to people. Okay, and this is the last slide on strengthening our message, and then we'll kind of, again, go back to the one we've been creating. And this is maybe one of the most important ones. Use stories to strengthen. So stories, just when any communication strategy, when you can tell a story with it, that's usually like the best way to go. So personal stories, or stories that you've experienced or that you know people around you have experienced. So Nicole and Anna are going to remember this story. But at our urban forestry management plan meeting, we had one of the residents come, a teacher came, and he was talking about how he had taught in this mobile classroom for like years and years and years. And it was fine. It was like the AC worked, it kept up with things. And then for whatever reason, someday they came and they took out the tree outside his classroom. And the tree had been providing shade, and so that kept the room nice and cool. And after it was cut down, the classroom was like too hot for his students to work in and think in and do well in during the summertime. And so it's like you can't buy that material. That's like golden stuff right there. And it's like real. And so when he told that story, it's like, it's not data like, X number of trees in Claremont, but it's like a real anecdote with power. And so whatever your anecdote is, like if it's trees that you care about and you had something like this happen, For me, like, when I experienced our first tree planting at Sustainable Claremont, like, it was amazing. It's like you go on a Saturday morning, like at 8:30, and there's 100 people there to plant trees. It's like, this isn't like a thing that happens in cities. And they're like turning people away because there are too many volunteers. It's like a crazy thing. And so it was like a really powerful thing that when I talk to people about Sustainable Claremont, it makes it really easy, because it's not like a fact I have to remember. It's something that I experienced and that's easy to talk about. Or why I got involved in climate to begin with. I read Bill McKibben's End of Nature. Freeman and I were just talking about his new book. And it was powerful for me. And something clicked after reading that book that sort of changed the course of my PhD. It changed the course of what I spent my life writing about, and now, in this professional capacity. And it was all because of this book that I read that was kind of old when I started reading it. But for whatever reason, picked it up. So that's another thing where it's like my experience, and then when I talk to people about climate, it's an entry point. It's like a wedge that I could drive in to start talking about the issues that I care about. Okay. And last is really important. It's to stay out of the weeds. So stay out of the details. You don't need to get into the details. When you're talking about climate, don't talk about the science. There's a room with probably more than one scientist in this room. If you've ever had we all have, tried to have a political debate and you throw out a fact that you consider definitive, you've probably experienced that not ending the conversation, right? And there's a reason for that, right? It's when you're having these conversations, it's not about who has the more facts on their side. This is like a values-based discussion on the communication side. I know there's science to back it up. So stay away from that. Stay with what we had talked about in the previous slides. Big picture stuff, values, how we frame things, and out of the weeds, out of the details. There's a lot of literature out there about an effect called the backfire effect. When you present somebody who has different feelings or believes different things from you, and you give them a fact that counters what they already believe, it doesn't make them change their mind. It just entrenches what they already believe, right? And they fight back harder against it. And so it's a really easy way to entrench misinformation. And so it creates like a whole nother discussion about what you do with people who are misinformed then. But we don't have to worry about that because we're not going to fight the facts with them. Again, we want to get them to act no matter what they think about the science. So let's take a different approach. All right, so this is a whole new conversation. I know it's like bad form to put a slide full of text here, but I want to go through it because I think it's powerful. So let me read you through it, and we're going to shove it into the rest of our climate message. So I attended my first tree planting 3 months ago. Before that, I'd been writing on climate for years. I started a whole environmental politics course at University of Laverne, the first time they ever had it. So I cared about climate. But nothing I had really done felt like real or concrete or it was making a difference. Right? I would write these things and they'd kind of go out into the ether, or I'd have these students and maybe 2 of them would really care about climate or the environment. But after I started here on Arbor Day, I went out with Nicole and the Green Crew and Anna and 100 plus other volunteers, and I planted, or with 109 residents, maybe I'm hearing now that's incorrect. We planted more than 100 trees on baseline. And it solved this local problem, right? So according to Claremont's Community Service Department, more than 16,000 of the city's 24,000 trees are under threat due to disease or pests or drought or age, right? And so there's this problem that we sort of took a stab at solving that day, right? And so seeing neighbors come together, transform their community for like generations and generations and generations to come was one of the most powerful experiences I've had working in climate. I've had a lot of experience working in climate, but just that one day, like a couple months ago, that was like a really powerful thing. That's why I want you guys to do it too, right? And so what do we do with this message? So I want to take this personal story and this fact from a trusted messenger, right? And I want to insert it into my greater message that we started before. I won't read this. But you can see how we're building. We're stacking things on top of each other. So now we have this like whole narrative in this message about climate change, about urban forestry, about the benefits of acting and doing something, my own sort of personal story and how I felt doing this. And we have this trusted messenger in here, right? And then we have an ask at the bottom, right? We have an ask of resonance. So we started with that one little tab at the top, and now we're building this kind of comprehensive climate message, and what I think is an effective, I hope, climate message. And the message is just like, come support sustainable Claremont and plant trees and talk to everybody you can about climate, right? It's not we're giving you an avenue. We're giving you a path to do something. Okay. So don't. So this is just to reiterate some things that could really derail like a conversation on climate. Don't get into the weeds, so avoid that at all costs. Think big picture. Don't use jargon. Don't debate. We're not here to debate. We can have a conversation, right? Of course, that's what communication is, but we don't want to debate. And don't relitigate the science. Right? None of what I said about planting more trees did this, right? So we want to like keep it simple. And like that's trees, but Dick could make that message with eco-farm and community composting, right? Or Angela can make the same thing in probably 10 minutes on public health and climate, right? So it's what's important to you and what do you want people to act on. Okay, and so this is sort of just a follow-up. I was thinking about this last time we had a dialogue here with the Clean Power Alliance. It was maybe like 2 months ago-ish. And right after that, I had a sit-down, a lunch with someone from the gas company, SoCal Gas. And like it was like the natural enemies. Not really. But the gas company and Clean Power Alliance is focusing on clean power, like no fossil fuels. And what struck me is they were using my communication guidelines. So they were focusing on community choice, how it affects people here in Claremont. They were talking about money, how it affects your pocketbook, right? The price of energy. Do you want more money to send your kids to school or go on vacations? And values, community choice, not having somebody else make the decision for you. So it sort of shows, I think, in real time how very different organizations with very different interests have figured out, sort of cracked the code on communications. And they talk about what I talked about because they know it works, right? And so as climate communicators, we need to be armed with that same strategy when we're talking about climate. And so they know it works, and they care because their bottom line is affected by getting people to agree with them, right? And we care because we care about the environment, right? And so we just want to, I think, to me, it was sort of encouraging that in some way and discouraging in other ways, but to see that we're all sort of on the same page in how we talk about climate. Okay, so some final takeaways here, just to go back to what I laid out in the previous slides to run down. So first, build rapport. Make sure that you know who you're talking to, and you start with people. Inspire, empower, act. For a lot of us, we can do the inspire, but the empower and the act is a little bit more difficult. So I may like really care about climate change, but I might not know like what to tell people to do. So one is always to point them towards sustainable Claremont. But another is to check out Project Drawdown. It's just a good resource for ways of potentially, the whole purpose of Project Drawdown is to draw down emissions to zero. And so they're sort of on the climate is really their main focus. So it's a good resource, but there are a million other resources. That's just what I particularly like. So if you can inspire people, and then you can give them the empower them with the tools and the call to action with Drawdown, if you're looking for that. And then strengthen, using a trusted source, using a personal story. Okay, so if you've been paying attention, I've sort of set up this whole presentation here the way I've tried to tell you how to talk about climate. So we started off with some information about Americans, what they think about climate. So start with people. What a strong message looks like, how to create one. So that's sort of the inspire and empower part. Example of a strong message and information to provide that message. So we did that long message building. So that's sort of the strengthen. And now, what do we end with? An ask. So talk about climate. That's it. That's an easy ask. So I like genuinely feel that like the biggest impact that I'll personally ever have on climate is just talking about it. Like planting trees is great. Like I drive a Prius, which is a pretty small thing. I compost. But the more people I could talk to and get them to talk about it, and get them to think about it, and have that be a lens they look through for everything in their life, that's probably my biggest impact for climate. So just talk to people and talk to them again and again and again and again. Just keep it going. And support Sustainable Claremont, of course. Okay. All right, that sort of wraps up my talk.
For this part, since we're videotaping this and the video sound system doesn't pick up your questions very well, I'll ask that you speak into this microphone so it can be recorded and we can post this on Sustainable Claremont's website. And I have this evening a new experience for our outreach coordinator, Jen Pizzolo, who has agreed to take the microphone around and outreach to you so you can speak into it when you ask your question.
Raise your hand if you have a question, please.
This isn't exactly on communicating, but I keep hearing about people planting trees, and you were talking about that. And then what happens after that, like on baseline? Do you have people that are assigned to go water them after that?
Yes, so that's a good question. So this is like a question that keeps coming up in our urban forestry management meetings. So after we plant the trees, Sustainable Claremont has grants that we use to water the trees. So there's an initial follow-up with watering, and the city does some of this as well. So it's a sort of joint effort. So yes, there is watering, especially in the areas that don't have irrigation. A lot of the places that we plant already have irrigation or are on people's residences or parkways that they take care of. So they sort of agree to water.
As you approach this, climate change is a big problem. And what are your thoughts about starting small or starting with a larger project and feeding people into it so in the end you accomplish something larger, and it may not be creating a forest by planting trees, but it might be composting food waste with a small project when you have in mind a larger project such as a citywide movement in this direction, and then using the waste to generate local agriculture and that sort of thing. How do you move forward on those things?
That's a really good question. I think it's kind of like not a satisfying answer, but it's sort of all of the above approach. I think that, not to make this a commercial about Sustainable Claremont, but what Sustainable Claremont does well is we take ideas and we have like a volunteer base execute those ideas, and we try to take them to scale. And I think that there's, in this sort of climate space, I think that you need to show sort of proof of concept with things before cities and counties and states are going to take them on in like a serious way. So if it's composting, I think you have a local community composting, and then you take it to the city and you tell them, this is something that we can really do. Or for trees, it was community members coming together and planting some trees here and there, and then it blew up into this multiple grant-funded program. And so these are things that are happening. They start volunteer and they work their way up. And I don't think that they could have happened on the time scale we were at the other way around. And so we're showing that things can happen and that they're feasible at scale. And some things obviously have to work their way down from top to bottom. So when you're talking about like mass transit and infrastructure, codes and things like that, it's important to have local support, but you need top-down approach. So I think that with climate and the environment, it has to be a lens that you look at everything through. And sort of wherever you can make a difference, you do your best to make a difference. So I don't know if that's like a kind of sort of answer. Yeah.
So I really appreciated your final review of your presentation through the lens of your three strategy points. But I can't help but wonder if, in fact, you used this strategy or developed this strategy as you taught at Laverne, for example. I mean, I suspect, I really would have loved to have these three strategic points pointed out to me about 40 years ago.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think one of the most important classes I ever taught was the week after November 8th, a couple years ago. And I woke up the day after, and my email box through ULV was like inundated with questions about like what's next and like how could we be where we're at. And so I tried to come up with a lecture. We changed our weekly schedule, and at that time I was teaching a justice, sustainability, and politics of the environment course. And so I came up with like a lecture on how I like to do stuff about climate. And so that's kind of where this came from. It was that week I had students who didn't want to like hear any more like of my opinions on politics or reiterating what the news said after the national election. They wanted to know like what they can do. And so that was like really that poignant to me. Like that there's all the, people want to do something, but they just like don't know what, and they don't know how. And so that sort of made fresh in my mind, or made top of mind, that like this has to be a part of our strategy. Not just like, because I could recite the facts like in my sleep, but it's what can we really do to like make a difference? And so it wasn't like how I structured my courses for most of my courses, but it was something I was definitely aware of when I was doing my environmental politics course, and especially after the feedback I got from my students. Yeah.
Well, no, this is sort of a comment. I do a lot of volunteer work with the Botanic Garden, and part of what I've been doing recently over the last several months is surveys. We're wanting to get public input about some changes we may be making. So some of the questions that we're asking have to do with what their interests are. Our concept in doing this is, rather than our just telling them what we think they need to know, we want to know what they'd like to know. So a couple of the questions in particular have to do with themes that they might find interesting in the garden, and one of which is water-wise gardening. Off the top of my head, I can't remember them, even though I do these things every day. What I'm noticing is, and it surprises me, that some of the sustainable themes seem to be a little less important to them than some of the others. They do a scale between 1 and 10, or let us know whether it's interesting or not interesting or unclear. But anyway, so once I finish the survey itself, generally by then I've had some good rapport established with them, and I will ask about this. And what I'm learning is that a number of people are just tired of hearing about it. They were enthusiastic a few years ago, but are starting to lose interest. They feel inundated, they feel powerless, and they're just fatigued. And so actually I've learned a couple of things that I think I might be able to help them with in terms of the little things that you can do. We also ask a question as to whether they are interested and active versus interested and maybe not so active. And they really struggle with that because they'll start thinking, okay, what is it that I do? Do I drive an electric car and so on? But anyway, the point is, I think the fatigue factor is tough, and they really sometimes just don't want to really talk about it anymore. So we have to be careful about alienating as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that gets to, again, like the approach that we're taking when we're talking about it. We could sort of beat over the head, the message about how bad things are, and sort of the doom and gloom of it, and that's really why I try to pull it back to like local actionable things, right? And so and things that can be acted on really easily. So at the Botanic Gardens, it's maybe having like really easy ways to recycle. And it's just something that you could actionably do right now. But like or water-wise gardening, right? That's something that people who attend the gardens like care about and is top of mind for them. But talking about, factory greenhouse gas emissions, it's like, it's not like a helpful way to approach. So I think always sort of having the angle of what's top of mind to that audience and what affects them personally and locally is sort of key to keep in mind. But I don't think it's an easy answer, and I think for like this audience here is going to be a different group from the Botanic Gardens clientele, right, or cohort. So just something I think that we have to be aware of as climate communicators.
One thing about little solutions, though, you get little benefit from it, though, huh? Do you ever ask, like, for something national? Because national would be a bigger solution with a bigger benefit. And so is the ask ever contact your senator or your congressperson, and change the economy, carbon fee with a dividend, for example?
Yeah, I think this gets to who is the audience. If the audience is sort of people I know and people who generally agree with me but I feel like aren't acting, then it's definitely contact your senator, your congressman, and personally, when I talk to them, not in my role as Sustainable Claremont Executive Director, vote, right, for certain people. But when we're talking to a greater public and you're not sure where they're at, then I think there are gains to be made by small-scale solutions. And I think a lot of the times, doing these small things, getting people involved in local efforts, it snowballs and it brings people into the movement. And so it's of course, it's not one or the other. It has to be all of the above. But I think we have to be aware of who we're talking to, who is our audience, and what we can get from the ask. Right? And so if I'm talking to a bunch of environmentalists, then I don't want them to ask them to use aluminum straws. Right? I want to ask for something much bigger than that, right? Because they're the true believers, right? They're the ones who are already on my side. So have a bigger ask. So yeah, we just have to be aware of that. Yeah, I think you're 100% right, though.
As one of the attendees was mentioning, a lot of people, me included, tend to feel overwhelmed at times, hopeless. The more you know, the worse you feel. The more Bill McKibben books that pile up on the bookshelf, the more you can feel paralyzed. But when you talked about tree planting in Claremont, it was evident that that was an antidote for you personally, that it gave you a lot of hope, if I could, speculate. And I wonder if that needs to be almost one of the messages, is not only asking people to act, but enticing them to believe that through making a small action, this can actually give you some hope, and it's a way out of the hopelessness that can come from being inundated with so many facts and media reports.
That's sort of I think, an internal question that we're having at Sustainable Claremont right now. We've been having this in our weekly meetings. I think you're right. At sort of the local level, we want to have these solutions that are real and that give hope. Because for me, that's what it did. And there's a lot of things that for me gives me hope, like composting at home. Like, it's a small thing that I could do, but like, it's a real thing, and like, it matters. And so in our messaging, I think we do want to include hope as like, a real part of it. What I start to shy away from is, like, we want to be real too. And like, I think that we don't want to give, sounds pretty brutal, false hope, right? We're in like a really serious problem, and like the climate change is like a real emergency. And if we don't do something, right, we know what the trajectory is. And so we want that to be clear too, because for me, that was like an equally powerful part of the equation. It's like, I'm doing what I'm doing because I'm scared. Like, I know what the impacts are. Like, the science is real and it's clear. So I think this is kind of what I was getting at early on in the presentation when I was talking about this sort of debate about the tone and how we want to couch that. If it needs to be hopeful, and for certain audiences, I think it does, right? Like, when we're trying to get people to plant trees, we want it to be hopeful because it is hopeful and we're doing something good. But also, being honest about where we're at and how far we need to go. I think we need to find a way to incorporate both of those into how we talk about climate. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's just a difficult part of this conversation, is sort of having those two parts, which are both real and both like important elements of it. But I think for me, it feels like a case-to-case sort of thing. And I haven't yet figured out what that line is. I think it depends on the context. So it's not like the nicest answer, but it's the real one. It's how I really feel about it.
Hi. So this is a great topic. I'm actually a science communicator and neuroscientist. So my point is just a comment. And in fact, this weekend I was at a science communication event where there was a whole panel on climate change with climate scientists. And what I just want to point out is that the challenge that, I'm so glad you guys are talking about this, and it is so important. And none of what you said tonight had to do with really climate science. It's really neuroscience, right? It's like, as big as a challenge as climate change and a climate disaster and all this is, our biggest challenge is not, that's for the climate scientists and the climate scientists in the room, but the biggest challenge is getting people on board, which is bonkers and frustrating and maddening, but just to realize that really is the biggest challenge, is to get humans on board. Yes, humans are causing these changes, but the things we're doing by putting fuel into the air are less of a challenge than changing our minds. So it's just, it's great that you're really tackling this and thinking through these things, and it's so important, and everything you said tonight, I totally resonates, and, you know, making it relatable, and so yeah, not really a question, but just thanks for tackling it.
I want to respond in part to what you were saying and to what you were saying, and take it to the community-wide level, that the city has adopted wonderful policies about sustainability, which my opinion is that they're not implementing them. So we have a group of people who've been very actively encouraging net zero development. And there's everything in the city's sustainability plan and its general plan to support that, as that and all development as being designed, and all decision-making in the city is supposed to stem through a sustainability prism, like you were saying, all decisions coming from this commitment. So there's not enough sense of urgency at the city level, or there's not been a way to express and implement that sense of urgency that's going on right now. And so as this is a sustainable Claremont event, so I'd like to know, as an organization, what more can be done, not just to give individuals a sense of maintaining that prism, not just giving people enough of a sense of urgency and hope that they're acting. I personally think that one of the things that helps me most is I don't attach an expectation of success to my efforts. I think the ship's going down. And I think that it's a very different event if it's done while people remain loving and active and making every gesture possible to be the very best humans we can be as the ship goes down. I think that's an important thing to have happen no matter what. That's not what I'm advocating for, you know, but I think there's so much more to be done at the community level, both as in, you know, as individuals, as private citizens, as collections of families and religious institutions, like you're saying. But what about the city government itself and its capacity to implement our highest ideals, which have already been adopted and aren't being implemented?
So I think it comes back to sort of what I had in my ask. It's getting people to voice their concerns to city government. And this is one of the things that, you know, Sustainable Claremont's we try to educate the public. We try to provide an avenue for action. And whether it's, you know, talking about the Village South project or if it's talking about trees. Part of this message is that we need to work with the city, right? We need to work with our state legislators, right? Our state assembly members, and we need to work with our city council members and mayor. And so I think that, you know, the city sustainability plan and how we think about these development projects, these are conversations that people need to have with their representatives, right? And that we're trying to have with representatives. But I think it can't just come from Sustainable Claremont, right? It has to come from the community. All of these are issues that affect the community, and they affect every element of the community. I truly believe that, like, it's a lens that we have to look at everything through, like through sustainability and climate. And so that means everybody has a voice, or needs to have a voice in this. So it's not like an easy answer, but members of the public who care and want to have their voices heard need to speak with their office holders about these issues. Right? Need to show up to talk about these issues.
Well, you've been planting trees. I live on Bonnie Brae, just above Baseline. And we have a lot of dead trees on Baseline. Are those going to be taken down to allow space for those new trees to grow?
Yeah, I'm not the person to ask that. So the sort of the taking out of city trees, that's a decision made by Claremont Community Services Department. And I'm not sure the specifics of that. That would be a question for maybe Jeremy Swan or Dave Rogers or somebody in their department. So we don't do any of the tree taking out or maintenance. We're strictly planting right now, anyway. Yeah, yeah. So a lot of the times once a tree is taken out, we'll plant where the tree once was, but we don't make the decisions over which trees get taken out and which don't. So that's a city's decision.
Does Sustainable Claremont decide what species of tree gets planted?
No, so there's a city tree list that's used, and each street has different trees that can be used, and so we go by that list when we're planting. So there are different like quadrants, not quadrants because there's not four, different sectors of the city that get planting at each of our plantings. And so different neighborhoods and different streets will get different trees. And so there are a lot of factors that go into that, and then we plant the trees that the city drops off. Yeah.
One of the things that we hear emphasized an awful lot is how time is passing and how little time we have before we cannot really address climate change. One of the things I learned from Bill Kibben's book that I hadn't thought about before is that extinctions in the past have largely been related to levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And we're facing that, and he emphasizes the need to really move fast. Well, the procedures you lay out here sound like they might be good if we had a lot of time, but how do we move fast?
Yeah. Again, I think it comes back to the sort of all hands on deck, multi-strategy approach. We need tree plantings and community composting, and we also need changes in the decision makers at the highest levels of government. And so I think that the different organizations are working on different strategies, right? And so an organization like Claremont is community focused, and we're focused on what's happening in our city and beyond, but like it's a regional organization. And I think that obviously a major part of the climate movement, if we're to make progress, is going to have to be done at the national, international level, right? And so I think that they're just sort of two connected things, but two different things, and we need both. We need bottom up and top down.
Well, another part of that question, what do you think we ought to do with a book like this by Bill McKibben, Fraught? Should we give a copy to the city council members? Should we just tell people, well, it's too technical?
So I've given away more than my fair share of Bill McKibben books. So you don't have to convince me of that. People turn them down for me. So we can give them Bill McKibben, Elizabeth Colbert, there are plenty, David Wallace Wells. But yeah, I think that and I think this kind of goes back to a point that was made earlier, that we need to have these conversations with members of our local government and members of our state government and your state representatives and federal representatives. This is a conversation that we need to have with every level, right? And whether it's giving them a book or having the conversation in person over a cup of coffee or in their office, I think that the more that they know that it's top of mind for us, that it's something we care about and something that we vote about, the more success we'll have.
So a number of these questions have led me to ask this question of you, because I think what you described was sort of a broad-based approach to bring a lot of people along, people who aren't necessarily thinking about this and have to have a way to have it resonate with them. And I absolutely believe that that's very important. To Freeman's point, it can be a slow process. It feels to me, in my sort of anecdotal observations, that this has been happening over the last generation or so. And I'm wondering if any of the statistics that you looked at sort of provide trends of which Americans have different attitudes, and if a younger generation, younger cohort, has actually shifted their thinking in much greater levels than others, because that would show, maybe that there's a trend in the right direction.
Right.
And then the follow-up piece to that is, how do we act on those trends if?
I think that, again, I think this comes back to like, how are we asking the questions and what information are we trying to get? A strong majority of Americans favors increasing solar and wind. Whether you parse that out by party, it's still a majority of Americans. A majority of Americans are in favor of a carbon tax. A majority of Americans support, I can't think of them off the top of my head now, but an increasing number of like climate solutions, right? And whether or not, and probably not, these are going far enough, like that's a different question. But I think that the trend line is going in the right direction. And so it really is, like I genuinely believe, it's just us, local groups like this, making sure that we vote and making sure that the people who represent us know how much we care about climate. For the large scale change, I think that's the most effective route. For the local climate, action, I think it's the things that we're doing here now, right? And expanding those things and looking at, there are a plethora of things that we could be doing or adding to sort of our list of sustainability measures that we have. But I think at the national level, I think there's room for hope. And I think too, it's not like an either or type of thing. Like a world in which we're 4 degrees warmer than we are now is like immensely better than a world we're 8 degrees warmer than where we are now. And so there's a large scale of difference, and like that difference will affect like millions and millions of lives. And so I think we're having a greater impact as time goes on, and I think there's a little room for hope and doing a little bit better. And I see this a little bit with things like the Green New Deal. There are mixed opinions about that, but that it's even like part of the discussion now, I think is great.
Okay, so on that same note, kind of thinking about it, so I was interested that you brought up the Bill Nye example at the beginning, that maybe inflammatory language isn't the best. And I'm interested too, because this came up this weekend, this panel I was mentioning. Is it helpful for people to have these like very emotional or kind of inflammatory draw reaction? And I think it goes back, like to me, when I watched it, I was like, yes, 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 Bill, please, like wake up, let's do something. And I think it comes to like the audience, right? So you're not gonna go to Sustainable Claremont or to a tree planting and talk like that. You're not gonna go to a meeting like that. It depends on who you're talking to. And again, like honestly, last week with John Oliver, that's us, like that's this audience, right, basically. And so we want to hear that, like just shake you by the lapels and be like, wake up and do something, we're grown-ups now, so I think it depends on the audience, but I think there can really be value in that really shock, even inflammatory thing, because Bill Nye spent 25 years, 30 years building that rapport, so he kind of has that capital in the bank where he can drop the F-bomb and blowtorch the globe and get our attention, but so I think there's value in that. And I'm interested to hear anybody else, but I think, again, it comes back to choosing your audience, choosing your message for that audience. But I think that there is value because, planting trees is not going to get us down to 2 degrees, you know what I mean, of change.
I think it's all part of the spectrum, and it's who we're talking to and about what. There's a great book that just came out a couple months ago by David Wallace Wells called The Uninhabitable Earth. And the whole thesis of the book is to present worst case scenario. So we have these climate models, and we always try to talk about, if we get to 2 degrees of warming versus 1.5 degrees of warming, sort of what that difference looks like. His is like business as usual, 8 degrees of warming. What's this planet going to look like? And that's like I think a bad approach for talking to the public about climate change. For me, it's a really good approach because you know, this is something that I live and I talk about all the time, and it's like the Bill Nye thing. It sort of lights the fire again. And it's kind of like what I was talking about earlier, the early approach of like doom and gloom. It's like it kind of revs up that activist base. And so for some of us who might, you know, be feeling burnout, or like we've heard this a million times before, I think it could be really helpful to kind of light that fire again. And it's a really good book.
Since you are talking to us, what is your thoughts on the most important national thing that we could do? Would it be a carbon fee with a dividend, or would it be some other type of laws and changing, you know, moving society in a different way?
You're going to get me in trouble here. Carbon fee and dividend's good. Overall rehaul of the transportation system, ban cars, I don't know. We need to really start rethinking top down. And so that's the more radical side of things. But I think it's like, this is like the status quo is a radical position. Right? That's radical. Doing what we're doing, that's like the radical position. That's like what's getting us into this trouble. So like having like major overhaul of, you know, of not putting how much greenhouse gas emissions we are into the atmosphere, that's not radical. Like that's like sensible. That's conservative. Yeah, sure. Right? And so like I'm fine starting with the Green New Deal. Like, you know, have that be a starting point, and like let's work through that. And like, you know, and there's a bill, you know, we could go into that. Like there are a lot of different ways of looking at that. It's not even really a policy, it's like an idea framework. But having that as a starting point, I think, is like a workable starting point. Yeah.
Actually, the carbon fee with the dividend there is a bill, HR 763, energy innovation, carbon dividend. Yeah.
I want to, I know our time's short, but I want to go back to the very beginning of what you said about tone, and I'm really glad we have a neuroscientist activist here, because I think we can't get to step 2 if we can't get to step 1 with people. And it's so easy to be self-righteous or preachy. And I know there's a whole science about, I think it's actually in the economics field, the psychology of economics, where they're studying nudging and how do we move people to new behaviors. And I'm going to try this on you because my friends have told me I sound like an evangelical and their hackles go up. I sincerely believe that every one of us, it's great to plant trees, I'm all for it. But in my opinion, at least 3 times a day, we can make an impact on the global environment by being vegan. And when I use the word vegan, I don't know what happened in your gut or your mind, but people move back. And if I say plant-based, they know I mean vegan, and they do the same thing. So how is it that I, as a really nice lady who really believes this and there's science to back it up, can say to this community of already committed sustainability people that my wish is that we would all honestly, sincerely explore our food choices, because our food choices in every meal can make a significant impact, as much more than recycling or a lot of the other things that we think of. But if my saying that in that moment, there was a part of you that was like, oh, there she goes, then that's the point. How do we have these conversations, really have them, so that there's an invitation and an opening and a connecting that comes when we bring this up? Because it's so easy for a whole bunch of really nice people with shared commitment to even have that. So I guess my invitation is that we explore even more. How do we go ahead and learn the really delicate art of communicating this thing we care about so much in a way that is kind and above all, and also effective. And you know, I think we took that as a given. We even took it as a given that this is a partisan issue. I mean, that in itself is madness. And it doesn't have to be that way, and it didn't used to be a partisan issue. So how do we even deconstruct that? So we're not any longer operating with the assumption that it is one, and maybe look at how we can gently unravel that so it goes back to being something we all share.
Yeah. I don't know if that was more of a comment than a question. I think I might have missed the question.
I do have the request that maybe we take the time to play around more, and we have people with that skill, with how do we actually go about doing this?
Right, and I think that...
Not just say have a nice tone.
Right, and then I think that sort of getting back to what you said too, part of it's just having the conversation, right, and seeing what works and what doesn't work. And I was vegan for a long time, and I know the feeling when you tell somebody that you're vegan, and so the visceral reaction of maybe being asked not to eat something. But I think these are like conversations that we just need to keep having, and figuring out what works and what works for the small scale and what works for the large scale, and trying to pull it out of the politics and push it into action.
I hate to say it, but these dialogues are scheduled to run until about 8:30, so I think maybe if we had one or two more. I can't leave Sally out.
Well, Jennifer gave me the courage to raise another issue that it seems to me is so fundamental, and yet we always avoid in these kinds of conversations. Well, actually, there are two. One is wealth inequality, and the data show that greater equality is better for everyone. But the other issue that nobody wants to talk about is that there are too many people on this planet, that we had a population that was viable in 1930, we are now nearing 4 times what the planet can sustain. And it will call for all kinds of things, not just going vegan, but a whole lot of more extreme things to deal with this. But we shouldn't keep avoiding the fact that there are too many of us. And if there were a fourth as many people doing what we're doing, it wouldn't be affecting the climate the way this bunch of us are.
Any last questions? Angela?
I hate to change the topic on what you just said, but I really was wanting to comment on something you were saying about, I felt like you answered your own question when you said, you know, how do you feel about going vegan? And then in the next breath, you said, how can we have a conversation about our food choices? And to me, that second phrasing is much less visceral. I think when you talk about food, you're really going to the gut. I mean, and people do have such a strong, it's wired in probably, right? I mean, not probably, it definitely is. And I think that starting at a place that doesn't send off those, you know, amygdala kind of alarm bells in people is a really good strategy. And I think you said it yourself. And that goes to other conversations around population, around, you know, how do you get to work every day? How do you, you know, maintain your home? How much do you consume? We have to be sensitive to those sort of gut level reactions that we might set off in people unintentionally, which means they shut down.
Thanks, Stuart, for his presentation. And I think we also ought to thank Eddie G. for videotaping and Jen for managing the microphone. And I'd like to announce the next sustainability dialogue, which will be in just 2 weeks. And this time it's going to be something very different. It's going to be on social sustainability. Cindy Rule, who's very active with the League of Women Voters, has put together an amazing compilation of the complexity of gerrymandering, and the title of the talk is Gerrymandering and Voter Suppression. So that will be here on June 3rd at the same time. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you, guys.